He thought no one would stop him. A bully at school grabbed a quiet girl by the throat and taunted her right by the lockers, while a crowd filmed everything on their phones. But in the next moment, the door opened, and her father, the legendary Chuck Norris, walked in. What happened next shocked the entire school. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching this story from. The morning at Ridgewood High began like any other, with the echo of chatter bouncing off lockers and the shrill ring of the first bell commanding students to hurry into their classrooms. The smell of floor polish still lingered faintly from the custodian's early cleaning, mixed with the faint aroma of cafeteria coffee drifting from down the hall. Sneakers squeaked, laughter rang, and the endless shuffle of backpacks and books filled the air. To most, it was nothing but another ordinary school day. But to Dakota Norris, youngest daughter of a man the world knew simply as Chuck Norris, every day carried with it an undercurrent of tension. She walked carefully along the corridor, her books pressed tight against her chest, her dark hair pulled back neatly into a ponytail that swayed slightly with each step. Dakota had learned long ago to keep her head down, to blend into the noise of the hallways, to avoid the spotlight that seemed to follow her wherever she went once someone remembered her last name. For her, invisibility was safety. She moved with quiet precision, slipping between groups of students without calling attention to herself, eyes often lowered as if the floor might swallow her whole. To her classmates, she was an enigma. Everyone knew who her father was. It was impossible not to. He was a man who had defined entire eras with his martial arts mastery in action films, a living legend who had become both hero and myth. For many, the mere mention of the name Chuck Norris conjured up images of indestructible strength, calm discipline, and the sort of power that was whispered about half in admiration and half in jest. But Dakota didn't carry herself like the daughter of such a man. She wasn't loud, brash, or intimidating. She didn't wear the confidence of someone raised in the shadow of a legend. Instead, she was quiet, reserved, thoughtful, and maybe a little shy. In her backpack, tucked among textbooks and spiral notebooks, she carried a small, leather-bound journal. Inside it were her sketches and notes, fragments of poems, and the kind of reflections she never dared to say aloud. The pages were her refuge, a world where she could wrestle with thoughts that she could never voice in the halls of Ridgewood. Words her father had said to her sometimes appeared there too, fragments of wisdom about discipline, respect, and courage. Yet even those felt distant when she sat alone in the cafeteria or stood at her locker surrounded by people but unseen. There had been times when she considered telling people more openly who she was, not because she wanted to brag, but because sometimes she thought maybe, just maybe, it would earn her some measure of respect or at least protection. Yet each time she stopped herself, because she knew what would follow: comparisons, questions, jokes, endless, shallow chatter about her father's movies, or worse, the mocking jabs about how she could never measure up to him. The very idea made her stomach knot, and so she kept silent, allowing her classmates to see her as a no one special. But in high school, silence is rarely left alone. As she passed a group of students near the lockers, she caught fragments of conversation, laughter that swirled like smoke, and stung even when not aimed directly at her. She could feel eyes follow her for a moment, then drift away again, as if she wasn't worth their attention. That was what she preferred, though the indifference still weighed on her. Better to be overlooked than mocked. Better to disappear into the crowd than to stand at its center. Yet she was never entirely free of the name she carried. Sometimes it arrived in whispers when she passed by. "That's his daughter." Sometimes it came with a snicker, a muttered line about roundhouse kicks or bad jokes pulled from the internet. And sometimes it arrived in silence, the uncomfortable kind when a teacher paused while calling roll, or when another parent asked about her family. It followed her like a shadow, never visible but always felt. Dakota often wondered what her classmates imagined of her home life. Did they think Chuck Norris sat at the dinner table in full gi, offering lessons between bites of food? Did they imagine a house where the walls were lined with trophies and belts, where discipline was carved into every moment? The truth was simpler, softer. Her father was kind, steady, and even humorous in private. He was not a man who boasted or strutted. He was a man who loved his family, who prayed with them, who taught by example rather than by command. At home, he was dad. At school, he was a shadow she couldn't escape. She tried not to think about it as she made her way to her locker. She focused on small things instead, the way her shoes squeaked against the waxed floor, the cold metal handle of the locker beneath her palm, the faint crinkle of the paper posters taped to the walls. They proclaimed messages of kindness and respect, bold letters reading, "Be the change," or "Stand up for what's right." She glanced at them and wondered if anyone ever truly read them, if anyone ever believed them. To her, they felt like decorations for a world that rarely matched their promises. When she pulled open her locker, a stack of notebooks nearly tumbled forward. She caught them just in time, her heart pounding from the small scare. Sliding them back into place, she glanced at the corner of a photo pinned inside her, and her father smiling on a family trip, his arm slung warmly around her shoulder. She looked at it only briefly before shutting the locker again, careful not to linger. She knew too well the risk of being seen with that image in the open. The rest of the morning passed in much the same way it always did. Class after class, teachers lecturing, students whispering, the endless hum of adolescence that carried her along like a current. Yet under it all was the sense of unease she could never quite shake. It was the knowledge that in this school, quietness was not seen as strength, but as weakness, and weakness was a target. When lunch arrived, she sat at her usual table in the corner of the cafeteria, away from the main throng of chatter and commotion. She pulled out her journal and began scribbling notes, phrases that came to her in fits and starts. Stand firm. Discipline is not loud. Strength is control. They were pieces of her father's teachings, rephrased through her own lens. Writing them made her feel steadier, even if only for a moment. But as she wrote, she felt the flicker of eyes on her. A shadow passed over the page, and she looked up just long enough to see a group of boys at another table glance her way, laughing about something she couldn't hear. She didn't need to. She knew the tone, the smirk, the way they leaned close to each other as if sharing a secret joke. Her stomach twisted. She dropped her gaze back to the page, forcing her pen to keep moving, even as the words blurred. The day ended without incident, but the unease lingered. As she walked home, her backpack heavy on her shoulders, she thought about the halls of Ridgewood, about the eyes that watched, about the laughter that hovered just beyond her hearing. She thought about the weight of her father's name, and how it seemed to make her both untouchable and vulnerable all at once. She wondered how long she could keep her head down before someone decided her silence was an invitation. That night, as she sat at her desk by the window, the glow of the lamp spilling across her journal, she could hear the faint murmur of her parents talking downstairs. Her father's voice was calm, steady, the same voice he used when giving advice or telling stories. She thought about going down, about telling him how she felt at school, but the words caught in her throat before she even rose from her chair. She didn't want to disappoint him. She didn't want to seem weak. Instead, she wrote, line after line, filling the page with the things she could not say aloud. Her hand trembled slightly as she finished a sentence. I don't want to be invisible, but I don't know how to be seen. She stared at the words for a long time before closing the journal. The house grew quiet as the night deepened, and still she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind turning circles around the same fears. She wanted to believe the posters on the school walls. She wanted to believe in kindness, in respect, in standing up for what was right. But in her heart, she knew Ridgewood High did not work that way, at least not for her. And though she could not yet see it, the silence she feared would soon shatter. For already someone had noticed her too much, and already a storm was forming in the hallways she walked each day. A storm that would test her, break her, and ultimately bring her father's footsteps echoing into the very heart of Ridgewood High. The following week unfolded with the same rhythm that Ridgewood High always carried. But for Dakota, the heaviness in her chest seemed to grow with every passing day. The air in the hallways felt thicker, the laughter around her sharper, and the shadows of suspicion and unease followed her more closely than ever. She had noticed glances more often now, the way certain students would turn their heads as she walked by, whispering with barely contained smirks. It was as if the entire building had reached an unspoken agreement that she was somehow different, Indifference at Ridgewood was dangerous. On a Tuesday morning, she arrived earlier than usual, hoping to slip into her first class before the crowd built up. But the plan didn't work. As she rounded the corner of the main corridor, the heavy sound of sneakers slapping against the floor echoed from the other end. A group of boys appeared, loud and careless, their voices carrying across the hall. At the center of them was Jason Miller, a name spoken often in Ridgewood and rarely with fondness. He was tall for his age, broad-shouldered, with the kind of careless arrogance that grew from never being told no. His hair was always a little too perfect, his grin just wide enough to hide the cruelty underneath. He walked like the hall belonged to him, and in many ways it did. Students parted instinctively when Jason came down the corridor. They pressed against lockers, fumbled with books, or pretended to be engrossed in conversations that had ended seconds before. He thrived on the silence he created, the way his presence stole the air and made others shrink. Behind him trailed two boys, both laughing louder than the jokes deserved, eager satellites caught in his orbit. Dakota had seen him before, of course. Everyone had, but until now he had never paid her more than a fleeting glance. This morning was different. His eyes locked on her the moment she turned the corner, and the grin that spread across his face made her stomach twist. He slowed his pace, his companions falling in step beside him, and the silence in the hall deepened like the hush before a storm. "Well, look who it is," Jason drawled as he came to a stop a few feet away from her. His voice carried easily down the corridor, just loud enough for others to hear. "Little Miss Norris, tell me, do you kick as hard as Daddy does, or do you just hide behind his name?" The words were casual, but the weight of them struck like a punch. Dakota froze, clutching her books tighter against her chest. She felt the heat of dozens of eyes on her, students who had stopped to watch, curiosity pulling them closer. Her heart thudded in her chest, but she forced her face into a mask of neutrality. She would not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She bent her head slightly as if she hadn't heard and started to move past him. Jason shifted smoothly, stepping into her path. His shoulder brushed hers with deliberate force, and the book slipped from her arms, spilling across the polished floor in a cascade of notebooks and loose papers. The sound of them scattering was sharp, followed instantly by the laughter of his companions. "Oops," Jason said, tilting his head in mock apology. "Clumsy, aren't you?" The laughter swelled, bouncing off the lockers. A few students had already pulled out their phones, their screens glowing as they lifted them to record. Dakota dropped to her knees quickly, gathering her things with trembling hands, refusing to look up at him. Her fingers brushed against a page that had slipped free from her notebook, a sketch of a tree with the words she had written beneath it. "Stand tall, even in the storm." She shoved it back quickly, hoping no one had seen, but Jason's eyes had caught the motion. "What's this?" he sneered, crouching just enough to glimpse the edge of the page before she snatched it back. "Little pep talks? Going to be a lawyer one day, Norris? Maybe you'll defend people in court with your diary entries." Laughter exploded from his friends, harsh and cruel, echoing through the corridor like a chant. Dakota swallowed hard, pressing the page back into her notebook. Her heart pounded, her throat burned with words she couldn't bring herself to say. She wanted to tell him to stop, to tell him he knew nothing about her or her family, but the fear of how it would sound, how it would only feed the mockery, kept her silent. She focused on gathering her books, her hands shaking as she stacked them again. Jason's sneaker suddenly slammed down on the corner of one of her textbooks, pinning it to the floor. The smack of rubber against cardboard reverberated in the silence that had fallen. Dakota froze, her fingers hovering just inches from the cover. Slowly she lifted her eyes and met his. His grin widened at the sight of her hesitation, the small tremor in her body. "Come on," he said softly, his voice low enough for only her to hear, though the menace in it carried everywhere. "Say something. Show us that famous Norris fire." The words sliced through her. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Shame burned across her cheeks, hot and unrelenting. She hated herself in that moment for being still, for letting him control the scene. She wanted to scream, to fight, to be fearless like her father had always been. But she wasn't him. She was just a girl, cornered in a hallway, surrounded by indifferent faces. Jason leaned closer, his hand braced against the locker above her shoulder. The clang of metal echoed, sharp and threatening. His friends laughed again, urging him on, their voices a cruel chorus. Students around them whispered, some glancing nervously at each other, but no one stepped forward. No one spoke up. "Don't walk away from me," Jason muttered, his grin twisting darker. "We're not finished." The tension thickened like a rope pulled taut. Dakota clutched her books tighter against her chest, her knuckles white, her body pressed against the cold lockers. She tried to edge sideways, but his arm blocked her path. Her breathing quickened, every inhale shallow and ragged. Her mind flashed with images of the posters taped unevenly on the walls, slogans about kindness and respect. How hollow they felt now, when not a single person moved to stop what was happening. The voices around her blurred into background noise, laughter fading into a dull roar in her ears. All she could feel was the weight of Jason's presence, the heat of his breath, the scrape of his sneaker against the tile. When the bell rang, its piercing shrillness ripped through the corridor, but it did nothing to break the moment. Students didn't move. They stood rooted, their phones raised, their expressions a mix of fear, curiosity, and quiet complicity. The ordinary rhythm of school had been broken, replaced by the oppressive silence of a cruel theater. Jason's smirk deepened, sensing her fear, feeding on it. He tapped his sneaker lightly against her book, dragging it across the floor before stepping back. The sound grated against her nerves, a deliberate reminder of his control. He leaned in once more, close enough that his voice was almost a whisper. "What's it like?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. "To be weak when your dad is supposed to be the toughest man alive?" The words cut deeper than any shove or blow. Dakota clenched her jaw, her throat tight with the scream she could not release. She wanted to believe she was stronger than this, that she could rise above his taunts, but in that moment she felt small, invisible, and utterly alone. Jason stepped back, his friends following him as he turned away, satisfied with the spectacle he had created. The crowd slowly dispersed, some laughing quietly, others slipping away with uncomfortable expressions. Phones were tucked back into pockets, whispers trailing off into the distance. Dakota remained by the lockers, her books clutched tightly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing the humiliation that burned her skin. She gathered the last of her things and rose slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She told herself it was over for now, but deep down she knew it wasn't. Jason had found his new target, and he wasn't going to stop, not until he had stripped her of every last shred of dignity. As she walked to her next class, her shoulders hunched, her eyes fixed on the floor, she felt the weight of the silence around her. No one spoke to her. No one asked if she was all right. They had all seen, and they had all chosen to do nothing. The storm had begun. The days that followed passed not in peace, but in a strained silence that wrapped itself around Dakota like a heavy cloak. Everywhere she went, she could feel the weight of glances, the whisper of laughter that trailed behind her steps. Jason's smirk had become a ghost in the hallways, even when he wasn't there. It lingered in the edges of conversations, in the way some students looked at her and then quickly turned away, pretending they hadn't been watching. She carried her books tighter, walked with her head lower, and hoped desperately that the storm would pass. But storms in high school rarely pass. They grow. By the end of the week, Jason was ready to make his presence felt again. He thrived on attention, and now that he had chosen her as his target, there was no chance he would let go so easily. The crowd had tasted the spectacle once, and he was eager to give them more. It happened on Friday, during the long lunch break, when the cafeteria was crowded and the halls outside overflowed with the students who spilled out into every corner. Dakota had taken her usual path to the quieter side of the building, away from the noise and chatter. She preferred to sit on the floor near the library, with her journal open across her lap, scribbling in fragments that helped her stay steady. But on this day, the air felt different. She noticed it when she rounded the corner, the sudden hush that spread in ripples, the way laughter faltered as heads turned toward her. Jason was waiting, He stood near the row of lockers, his arms folded across his chest, his friends flanking him like loyal guards. His grin spread as soon as he saw her, wide and cruel. A grin that said he had been planning this moment and had no intention of letting her escape. The crowd was already gathering, drawn by the scent of something about to happen. Phones came out quickly, screens lighting up, the quiet hum of recording apps filling the silence. Well, if it isn't Miss Norris, Jason said, his voice loud enough to carry across the hallway. Tell me, do you always walk around here like you own the place? Or is that just because you think Daddy's name protects you? Dakota froze, her stomach clenching as the eyes of dozens of classmates fixed on her. She gripped her books tighter, willing her legs to keep moving, to carry her past him without stopping. She knew from experience that words would do nothing but fuel him. Silence was her shield, however thin. She stepped forward, trying to edge around him, but Jason moved with her, cutting off her path with a smoothness that sent a wave of laughter through the crowd. Where you going? In a rush? His hand shot out suddenly, catching the strap of her backpack. With one sharp tug, he yanked it off her shoulder. The bag hit the ground with a heavy thud, the zipper bursting open as books and papers spilled across the tiles. Pens rolled away, a lip balm clattered against the lockers, and a small photo fluttered down like a wounded bird, landing face up in the middle of the circle that had formed around them. The crowd laughed, the sound cruel and eager. Jason bent slowly, his eyes fixed on the photo. He picked it up between his fingers and held it high above his head so everyone could see. It was a picture of Dakota and her father, smiling together, his arm around her shoulder, her face lit with happiness. Jason's grin widened as he dangled it like bait. Look at this. Daddy's little girl. Isn't that sweet? He shook it lightly, letting the photo wave in the air. But guess what? He's not here now. And you're nothing like him. The laughter roared, bouncing off the walls, filling the hallway with a sound that stabbed at her chest. Dakota lunged forward, desperate to snatch the photo from his hand, but Jason pulled it higher, shaking it just out of reach. The crowd jeered, cheering him on. She stumbled, her hand brushing his arm, but he only laughed louder. Then, with deliberate cruelty, he let the photo drop. For a fraction of a second, hope flared in her chest. She bent quickly, reaching for it, but before her fingers could touch the edge, Jason's sneaker came down hard, grinding the picture beneath his sole. The sound of paper crumpling under his weight was deafening. Dakota let out a broken gasp, so small that only those closest to her could hear. She froze, staring at the photo pinned under his foot, her father's smile distorted and smeared against the dirty tile. Her chest tightened, tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she forced herself not to cry. Not here, not in front of them. Oops, Jason said casually, lifting his foot to reveal the bent and dirty picture. Guess he's not so tough now, either. Her hands shook violently as she snatched it from the ground, cradling it against her chest as if shielding it from further harm. She curled around it, her body trembling with fury and shame, but the tears still refused to fall. She would not let him see her break. Jason wasn't done. He crouched beside her spilled belongings, shoving books aside with the toe of his shoe until his hand closed around her journal. He flipped it open, scanning the pages with a smirk. "What's this?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Oh, this is rich. Justice, fairness, no one should stand alone." He read aloud, dragging each word into a sing-song tone. "She wants to change the world, everybody. Maybe she should try standing up for herself first." The hallway erupted in laughter, sharp and merciless. The words cut deeper than anything he had done so far. Those pages were hers, private, the only place where she dared to put her thoughts. And now they were twisted, exposed, and ridiculed. She lunged forward, desperate to snatch the notebook back, but Jason held it easily above her head, flipping through pages as if he owned them. The humiliation spread through her like poison. Her body shook, her lips pressed tight together as she fought the scream rising in her throat. Finally, Jason snapped the journal shut with a loud clap and tossed it carelessly onto the floor. It slid across the tile, its corners bending. "Pick it up," he ordered, his grin fading into something colder. "Go on, crawl for it. Show us who you really are." Her cheeks burned, the laughter stabbing at her from all sides. She bent slowly, her fingers brushing the cover of the journal, when Jason's sneaker slammed down on it again, pinning it to the floor. She flinched at the sound, her hand recoiling instinctively. Jason leaned closer, his shadow swallowing her as he whispered, "You're weak, and everyone here knows it." The laughter swelled once more, cruel and relentless, echoing through the corridor like a storm. Students stood shoulder to shoulder, phones raised high, their screens glowing cold and unforgiving. Dakota's chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths, her vision blurring as she clutched the photo of her father tighter. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and vanish from their eyes. But there was no escape. As Jason straightened, his grin returning, she knew with a sickening certainty that this was only the beginning. He had no reason to stop, no one to tell him no, and a whole crowd willing to cheer him on. The school had become his stage, and she his unwilling performance. And as the bell rang again, piercing the air but doing nothing to break the scene, Dakota realized the truth that made her knees buckle beneath her. This wasn't just bullying anymore. This was war, and she was standing alone in the middle of it. The weekend that followed was heavy with silence. Dakota spent most of it in her room, her journal lying closed on her desk, the bent corners of the pages like open wounds she could not bring herself to touch. She had retrieved the photograph of her father and smoothed it as best she could, but the crease across his smile remained, a reminder she could not erase. Her mother had asked if something was wrong, her brothers had teased her lightly about being quiet, even for her, and her father had studied her face with those calm, piercing eyes of his. She had shaken her head, forcing a small smile, unwilling to admit the truth. She could not tell them that she felt like she was drowning in a place that was supposed to be safe. She could not bring herself to be the one who brought shame to the Norris name by being weak. When Monday came, the weight in her chest had grown worse. Each step toward the school felt like trudging into a storm she could neither avoid nor withstand. The building loomed large, its windows reflecting the pale winter sunlight, its doors opening and closing with the endless tide of students. Her legs were heavy, her breath short, and every instinct in her begged her to turn around and run. But she didn't. She pushed through the doors, clutched her books tighter, and told herself she could endure it. The morning dragged on, a blur of teachers' voices, the scrape of pencils, the shuffle of feet. She could not focus on a single word written on the board, her thoughts consumed instead by the memory of Jason's laughter, the sound of her journal slamming shut in his hands, the jeers of the crowd as her private words were twisted into weapons. By the time the lunch bell rang, her stomach churned with dread. She wanted to hide in the library, but her legs carried her down the hall, almost against her will. The corridor was packed. Students lingered near lockers, voices rising in a chorus of chatter and laughter. But when Jason appeared at the far end, the sound began to shift. Conversations faltered, laughter grew louder in anticipation, and a ripple of silence spread slowly outward as he walked. His friends trailed behind him, grins plastered on their faces, eyes gleaming with the thrill of the performance to come. Jason's gaze swept the crowd like a king surveying his kingdom, and when it landed on Dakota, the grin that curved his lips promised cruelty. She tried to slip away, to merge into the flow of students heading toward the cafeteria, but the crowd seemed to close around her. Phones were already in hands, screens raised, the air thick with expectation. Jason's footsteps grew louder, heavier, until he stood directly in front of her, blocking her path with the ease of a predator cornering prey. "Going somewhere, Norris?" His voice was smooth, casual but laced with menace. She clutched her books to her chest and shook her head slightly, her throat too tight for words. She wanted to keep walking, to pass him by, but his arms shot out, slamming against the locker beside her, with a clang that echoed down the hall. She flinched at the sound, her body pressing instinctively back against the cold metal. The crowd roared with laughter, phones lifting higher, faces lit by the glow of their screens. Jason leaned closer, his breath hot and sour, his grin wide and mocking. "Don't ignore me. I asked you a question." Her lips parted, but no sound came. She hated herself for it, hated the way her voice stuck in her throat. the way her body trembled under his gaze. She wanted to speak, to fight, to push him away, but fear wrapped around her like chains. Jason's hands shot out, gripping the strap of her backpack. With one sharp tug, he hauled her forward, the books in her arms spilling across the floor once again. They scattered in every direction, sliding across the tiles, pages fluttering open like broken wings. The laughter swelled, sharp and cruel. She dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather her things, but Jason's foot came down on one of her notebooks, pinning it in place. She froze, her fingers just inches from the cover, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the noise around her. "Pick it up," Jason sneered. "Go on. Show everyone what you are." Her hands shook as she reached for the notebook, but before she could grab it, his foot pressed harder, grinding the cover against the tile. She flinched, her body recoiling at the sound, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Jason crouched, his face inches from hers, his eyes gleaming with cruel delight. "Look at me when I talk to you," he whispered, his voice low and sharp. She turned her head away, her eyes burning with unshed tears. But his hand shot out, gripping her chin and forcing her gaze back to his. Her vision blurred, the world narrowing to the weight of his hand, the heat of his breath, the merciless laughter of the crowd. "What's it like," he hissed, "to live in your father's shadow? To know you'll never be him? To know that without his name, you're nothing?" The words cut deeper than anything he had said before. Her chest tightened, her throat closing as tears finally welled in her eyes. She bit her lip hard, willing herself not to cry, not to give him the satisfaction, but the pressure was unbearable. Jason's grin widened. He stood suddenly, hauling her up by the collar of her jacket and shoving her hard against the lockers. The clang reverberated through her bones, the impact sending a sharp jolt of pain across her back. Her books slid further across the floor, but no one moved to help her. The crowd only laughed louder, their faces pale but eager, their phones capturing every second. He pressed closer, his forearm pinning her against the metal, his face inches from hers. She could feel the heat of his skin, the sharp tang of cologne mixed with sweat. Her lungs heaved, her chest rising and falling in frantic rhythm as fear consumed her. Then his hand moved. It slid upward, wrapping around her throat. The sudden pressure made her eyes widen, her body jerking instinctively. Her hands flew to his wrist, clawing and tugging, but his grip was iron, unyielding. She gasped, her throat closing under the weight of his palm, the air cut off in an instant. Her vision blurred, black spots dancing at the edges of her sight. The laughter faltered. For the first time, the crowd grew uneasy. The jeers quieted into murmurs, the glow of phone screens trembling in unsteady hands. Someone whispered, "He's going too far." But no one stepped forward. No one spoke. Dakota's chest heaved, her lungs burning with the desperate need for air. Her knees buckled, her body sagging against the lockers as his grip tightened. Her fingers clawed at his arm, but he only pressed harder, his grin twisting into something darker, more dangerous. Her vision narrowed, the world collapsing into a tunnel of blurred shapes and muted sounds. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, faster and faster, until it became unbearable. She thought of the photograph pressed inside her pocket, the crease across her father's smile, and the words he had always told her: discipline, strength, control. She tried to summon them, but they felt distant, unreachable. The crowd was silent now, suffocating in its complicity. Phones were still raised, but the laughter was gone, replaced by unease, by the cold realization that something terrible was unfolding. Her hands slipped from his wrist, her strength fading. Her body sagged, her knees trembling violently, her chest convulsing with the desperate attempt to drag in air that never came. The world tilted, spinning out of control, and for a terrifying moment, she thought this was the end. Jason leaned closer, his lips curling in a cruel smile as he whispered, "See? Even the daughter of Chuck Norris can't fight me." Her eyes rolled upward, her body going limp as the edges of darkness closed in. And in that suffocating silence, in that moment when the world seemed to collapse around her, the crowd finally felt the weight of their silence. But it was too late. The storm had reached its peak, and Dakota stood on the very edge of breaking. The silence that gripped the hallway was suffocating. Dakota's world had already begun to collapse into a blur of muted colors and muffled sounds, her body sagging against the lockers as Jason's hand clamped tighter around her throat. Her knees buckled, her strength seeped away, and the desperate rasp of air she needed refused to come. The faces around her, some twisted with nervous laughter, others wide-eyed with fear, swam in her dimming vision like distorted reflections in water. The cold metal of the locker dug into her back, grounding her just enough to feel the hopelessness closing in. Her mind screamed for help, but her body could no longer give voice to it. And then it happened. The sound of footsteps, steady and deliberate, struck the polished tile floor. At first she thought it was her imagination, some final echo her mind conjured as the darkness pulled her under. But the sound grew louder, sharper, resonating in the sudden stillness. Each step carried with it an authority that pierced the haze, a command woven into the very rhythm of the stride. The students felt it before they saw him. One by one, phones lowered, laughter died completely, and even Jason's grin faltered for a heartbeat. Heads turned toward the end of the hall where the figure appeared. Broad-shouldered, posture straight, gaze locked forward with unyielding focus. The atmosphere shifted instantly, as though the building itself recognized the weight of his presence. Chuck Norris had arrived. He was dressed plainly, jeans and a dark jacket, but nothing about him seemed ordinary. His every step demanded attention, not through force, not through noise, but through the quiet, disciplined power of a man who carried years of mastery and strength within him. His face was calm, almost expressionless, but his eyes burned with a sharpness that froze even the boldest whispers in the crowd. There was no need for anyone to announce who he was. Every student knew instinctively. Every student felt the change in the air. Jason's grip on Dakota's throat wavered, not loosening completely but faltering as he turned his head toward the sound of those footsteps. Confusion flickered across his face, followed by a twitch of something he didn't recognize. Uncertainty. He adjusted his stance, his bravado struggling to stay intact. Chuck stopped just short of the circle of students, his eyes fixed not on the crowd, but on the boy who dared to lay hands on his daughter. His voice, when it came, was low and controlled, but it carried to every corner of the hallway with crystal clarity. "Let her go." The words were simple, but they cut through the silence like a blade. Jason blinked, the smirk on his lips faltering for the first time. He glanced down at Dakota, who was gasping weakly, her hand still clawing at his wrist, then back up at the man standing only a few feet away. Recognition dawned on him, his lips parting slightly as though the words he wanted to speak caught in his throat. "You!" he stammered, his voice cracking. "You're—" Chuck didn't let him finish. His gaze never wavered, his eyes locked on Jason with a steadiness that made the boy feel like prey caught in a hunter's sightline. He didn't raise his voice, didn't step forward. The weight of his presence alone pressed against Jason's chest like an invisible force. "Let her go," Chuck repeated, slower this time, colder. Jason's bravado crumbled further. His hand loosened without him realizing, and Dakota collapsed forward, dropping to her knees on the tile. She gasped desperately for air, her chest heaving, the oxygen burning her lungs as she fought to steady her breath. She clutched her chest with one hand, the crumpled photo of her father still clenched tightly in the other. Relief and shock coursed through her in equal measure, but she didn't take her eyes off him. Her father was here. Chuck's gaze flickered down to her for only a heartbeat, softening just enough to show recognition and quiet reassurance, before returning to Jason. He took a single step forward, the sound of his boot striking the floor, reverberating through the hall like a drum beat. Jason instinctively stepped back, his shoulder brushing against one of his friends, who quickly moved aside, unwilling to share the spotlight any longer. "You think strength is about who you can hurt?" Chuck's voice was calm even, but it struck harder than any shout. "You think it makes you powerful to put your hands on someone smaller, someone weaker?" Jason's lips twitched, desperate to recover his bravado. "We were just messing around," he said, his words rushed uneven. "It's no big deal. Everyone knows it's just a joke." Chuck's eyes narrowed, his gaze slicing through the excuse. "Does she look like she's laughing?" His voice rose slightly, not in volume but in weight, each word heavy and undeniable. "Do any of you?" The crowd shifted uneasily. Students lowered their heads, some biting their lips, others staring at their shoes. The glow of phone screens dimmed one by one as devices slipped back into pockets. No one dared to laugh. No one dared to speak. Jason's smirk twitched again, forced and brittle. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as the silence pressed down on him. "She's fine," he muttered, his voice weak. "See? She's fine." Chuck advanced another step, his movements deliberate, steady. The tension in the hall grew unbearable, every student holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. "You think this is strength?" Chuck asked, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, yet somehow heard by everyone. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving Jason's. "This is cowardice." The word echoed through the corridor like thunder. Jason flinched visibly, his mask of confidence cracking further. His friends had already taken small steps backward, their eyes darting nervously between the two. The boy who had moments ago strutted like a king of the hallway now looked smaller, fragile under the calm ferocity of the man before him. Dakota coughed weakly, her breath still ragged, but she never looked away from her father. For the first time since the nightmare began, a spark of something new stirred inside her chest. Safety. She wasn't alone anymore. Chuck's expression remained unreadable, his posture relaxed yet unshakably strong. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't need to. His presence alone had shifted the balance of power, stripping Jason of the authority he had wielded so carelessly. The silence was absolute now, thick with awe and fear. Jason tried once more, his words a desperate grasp at the control slipping through his fingers. "Look, I didn't mean anything. We were just playing around. Everyone knows it's a joke." He gestured vaguely toward Dakota, who was still trembling on the floor. Chuck's gaze sharpened, his voice cutting like a blade. "Is she fine?" The question hung in the air, heavy and merciless. Jason opened his mouth, but no words came. His throat tightened, his lips trembled, and the silence that followed was his answer. Chuck closed the distance between them with a single step, the sound of his boot louder than the nervous breaths of the crowd. Jason stumbled back, but this time there was nowhere to go. The lockers pressed cold against his back, trapping him where so many of his victims had stood before. He looked around desperately, searching the crowd for support, but there was none. The students who had once cheered his cruelty now stood frozen, their faces pale, their loyalty evaporated in the presence of real strength. Chuck didn't raise his hand, not yet. He didn't need to. His voice alone was enough to shake the foundations of the boy's arrogance. "You will not touch her again," he said, his tone calm but carrying the weight of a promise that everyone knew would be kept. "You will not touch anyone again, because if you do, you will answer to me." Jason's bravado collapsed entirely. His eyes darted to the floor, his chest heaving, his hands trembling at his sides. The boy who had believed himself untouchable now stood broken, stripped of his illusion of power. The silence in the hallway was unbearable, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of awe, of respect, of the sudden understanding that something unstoppable had entered their world. And in that silence, every student knew that nothing at Ridgewood High would ever be the same again. The stillness that followed Chuck's words was unlike anything Ridgewood High had ever known. It was not the silence of fear or complicity, nor the nervous hush that had often accompanied Jason's swagger down the corridors. This was something heavier, a silence that pressed into every chest, that made the fluorescent lights above seem colder, that carved itself into the very air. The crowd of students stood frozen, their phones now forgotten in their hands, their eyes fixed on the man who stood in the center of it all. Jason's chest heaved as he leaned back against the lockers. His shoulders squared, as if he could hold on to some fragment of dignity, but his eyes betrayed him. The bravado was gone, replaced by a flicker of panic he could not hide. His lips twitched into a smirk that looked more like a grimace, his hands trembling as they clenched and unclenched at his sides. Chuck did not move quickly. He did not raise his fists, nor did he lash out. Instead, he stepped forward with the calm precision of a man who understood that strength was not in haste, but in control. The sound of his boot against the tile echoed like a drumbeat, steady and deliberate, each step eroding the fragile illusion of power Jason had left. "You think strength is in fear," Chuck said, his voice low, steady, carrying across the corridor with ease. "You think it's measured by how many people laugh when you hurt someone? How many look away when you take what isn't yours? But fear isn't strength. It's weakness dressed up in noise." Jason swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as the weight of the words pressed into him. He glanced to the side, hoping to catch the eye of one of his friends, but they had all stepped back, their faces pale, unwilling to stand beside him now. The audience that had once cheered his cruelty had abandoned him, their silence damning. Chuck's gaze never wavered as he closed the distance. Jason's shoulders tensed, his body shifting as if preparing to push past him. The boy's desperation surged in one last reckless act, and with a sudden shove, he threw his hand against Dakota's shoulder, pushing her aside to create space. The gasp from the crowd was sharp, a collective intake of breath as they watched. But the reaction that followed was quicker than any of them could process. Chuck's hand snapped forward, seizing Jason's wrist with a grip like iron. The motion was fluid, precise, a movement born not of anger, but of years of disciplined practice. Jason yelped, twisting instinctively, but he had no chance. Chuck pivoted, his body turning smoothly, his stance lowering as he pulled the boy forward. His hips shifted with practiced control, and in a single flawless motion, he executed a throw that lifted Jason from the ground as though he were weightless. The crash that followed as Jason's body slammed onto the tile floor reverberated through the hall like thunder. Gasps erupted from the students, some stumbling back, their phones slipping from their hands and clattering to the ground. Jason lay stunned, blinking at the ceiling, the air knocked from his lungs, his chest rising and falling in short, sharp bursts. Chuck crouched low, still gripping Jason's wrist, twisting it just enough to bring a gasp of pain without breaking him. The movement was efficient, controlled, designed to dominate without destroying. Jason's eyes widened, the reality of his helplessness dawning on him as he writhed beneath the unshakable hold. "Let me go," Jason hissed, his voice cracking. "This isn't fair. You can't do this." Chuck's eyes narrowed. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a cold whisper that only Jason could hear, though the intensity in his expression made the entire hallway feel it. "Fair? You think it's fair to put your hands on someone weaker? To humiliate? To crush them while others laugh?" Jason's lips trembled, his chest heaving with each labored breath. He tried to look away, but Chuck tightened the pressure just slightly, and his gaze snapped back, trapped. "This," Chuck continued, his voice unwavering, "is what control feels like. Real control. Not the kind you steal through fear, not the kind that collapses when the crowd stops laughing. This is discipline. This is strength." The words cut deeper than the pain in Jason's arm. For the first time, true fear flickered across his face. Not the fear of pain or humiliation, but the fear of truth, the fear of being stripped bare before everyone he had once commanded. Chuck held him there for a moment longer, the silence stretching unbearably. Then, with deliberate restraint, he eased the pressure just enough to let Jason move without breaking. The boy slumped to the floor, clutching his wrist, his body trembling with humiliation as much as with pain. Chuck rose slowly, towering above him, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. The students remained frozen, their faces pale, their eyes wide with awe. No one moved, no one dared to speak. The silence was profound, reverent, as if they were standing not in a school hallway, but in a place of judgment. He turned his eyes back to Jason. "If you ever lay a hand on her again, if you ever put your hands on anyone like that again, I won't stop at reminding you. I'll teach you in a way you'll never forget." Jason's lips parted, but no sound came. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, his gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet the eyes that bore into him. The boy who had strutted through these halls as though they belonged to him now looked like nothing more than a child, small and broken. Chuck let the words linger, their weight settling on every student in the hall. Then with a slow breath, he straightened to his full height. His voice rose slightly, carrying not just to Jason, but to everyone who had borne witness. "All of you watched," he said, his tone sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "You filmed, you whispered, you laughed. And when she was on the ground, when his hand was around her throat, you did nothing." A ripple moved through the crowd, students shifting uncomfortably, their eyes darting to the floor. Some swallowed hard, others bit their lips, shame burning across their faces. The weight of his words pressed into them, undeniable and merciless. "You think by doing nothing you're innocent?" Chuck asked, his voice growing firmer. "You're not. Silence is permission. Laughter is encouragement. Looking away is the same as holding her down yourselves." The truth of it hit them like a thunderclap. The posters on the walls with their slogans about kindness and respect seemed to wither under the weight of his words. For the first time, the students understood the hollowness of their silence, the cruelty of their complicity. Chuck's gaze softened slightly as it shifted to Dakota. She was still kneeling on the floor a few feet away, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, her hands trembling as she clutched the crumpled photograph against her heart. Slowly, he extended his hand toward her, steady and warm. She hesitated only a moment before slipping her fingers into his. The strength of his grip, gentle yet unyielding, steadied her trembling. He guided her to her feet, his arm briefly wrapping around her shoulder as though shielding her from the eyes of the crowd. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt the weight on her chest lift. She could breathe again. She was not alone. The students watched, their shame deepening as they took in the sight. For them, the spectacle was no longer about Jason or even about Dakota. It was about themselves, about the mirror held up before them in the form of Chuck's words. They had been part of it, not through action, but through silence. And now they could not look away. Chuck's final words settled over them like an oath. "Remember this. Power is not in your fists. It's not in how many people fear you. Power is in your control, in your discipline, in your choice to protect when others stay silent. That's strength, and that's the only kind that matters." The silence deepened once more, reverent now, as though the entire school had been marked by the moment. Jason remained curled on the floor, humiliated and broken. His friends hovered at the edges of the crowd, unwilling to step forward, unwilling to share in his defeat. Dakota leaned into her father's side, her eyes wet with tears she could no longer hold back. But they were not only tears of fear. They were tears of relief, of pride, of the dawning realization that she carried part of that same strength within her. She had survived the storm, and though she had not yet found her voice, she knew now that she was not invisible. The lesson had been carved into the memory of every student in that hallway. They would not forget it. Not in days, not in years. And for Jason, lying broken on the floor, the scar of it would run deeper than any bruise. The corridor remained frozen long after Chuck's final words faded into the air. For a moment, the entire school seemed to hold its breath, every student rooted to the spot, every teacher at the far end of the hall silent and still. The only sounds were the uneven breaths of those who had witnessed the scene and the faint muffled sobs of Dakota as she leaned against her father's side, the storm of humiliation and terror finally breaking into tears. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder, clutching the crumpled photograph of the two of them as though it were a lifeline. Jason stayed where he had fallen, slumped against the lockers with his knees bent and his head bowed. The arrogance that had once animated every movement of his body was gone, stripped away as thoroughly as the smirk from his lips. His chest rose and fell in ragged bursts, his wrists still aching from the iron grip that had shown him what real control felt like. The boy who had ruled these halls through fear and cruelty now looked small, shrunken, and utterly alone. Even his closest friends, who had once orbited him like satellites, had drifted to the edges of the crowd, their eyes avoiding his, their shoulders pressed back against the lockers as if trying to vanish into them. Chuck guided Dakota a few steps forward, his arms steady around her. His presence still filled the hallway, but now it was less like the storm and more like its aftermath, the heavy stillness that follows thunder when the air feels charged with change. He paused, turning slightly to face the students, his gaze sweeping slowly across the sea of faces. Some looked away, their cheeks flushed with shame. Others stared back, wide-eyed, as though transfixed by the gravity of what they had just witnessed. No one dared to speak. "You stood here," Chuck said finally, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that reached even the farthest corners of the hall. "You watched. Some of you laughed. Some of you filmed. And when she was on the ground, when his hand was at her throat, you did nothing." The words landed like hammer blows, heavy and undeniable. Students shifted uncomfortably, their sneakers squeaking faintly against the tile. Phones that had once been held aloft with eager hands now hung forgotten at their sides. A girl near the front shoved hers deep into her pocket, her face burning red. "You think silence makes you innocent?" Chuck continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "It doesn't. Silence is permission. Silence is agreement. Every time you looked away, every time you laughed, every time you lifted a phone instead of a hand, you became part of it." The truth of his words pressed into their chests, sharp and merciless. Some lowered their heads, their hair falling forward to hide their faces. Others clenched their jaws, unwilling to meet his gaze but unable to deny it. The slogans on the posters along the walls: "Respect," "Stand up for what's right," "Be the change," suddenly felt like mockery, reminders of a hypocrisy they had all been living. Dakota lifted her head slightly, her cheeks streaked with tears, but her eyes locked on her father. His hand remained steady on her shoulder, grounding her, shielding her from the weight of so many eyes. She drew in a shaky breath, the air finally filling her lungs without the crushing weight of fear. For the first time in what felt like years, she felt safe. Jason shifted faintly on the floor, his pride bleeding from him as thoroughly as the air had been knocked from his lungs. He pushed himself onto his elbows, his eyes darting nervously from face to face. But the crowd that had once lifted him up gave him nothing. Not a single nod of support, not a single laugh to share his cruelty. He was alone, abandoned in the wreckage of the power he had thought unshakable. His lips parted, as though he might protest, might try to recover even a shred of the control he had lost. But no words came. His throat was too tight, his voice strangled by the truth that surrounded him. Chuck crouched slightly, bringing his face level with Jason's. His voice was steady, quiet, but it carried to every ear, every heart. "You thought this was strength. You thought hurting someone weaker made you powerful. But strength isn't in cruelty. It isn't in fear. It isn't in how many people you can break. Strength is in how many people you can protect. Real strength is discipline. Real strength is restraint. And you don't know the first thing about it." Jason's face flushed red, his eyes glistening with the sting of humiliation. He tried to look away, but Chuck leaned in just enough to force his gaze back. "That isn't strength," Chuck finished, his tone sharp, final. "That's cowardice." The words struck like a verdict, echoing through the corridor until it seemed etched into the very walls. A murmur rippled through the students, soft, uneasy, like the stirrings of conscience that had been long buried. They shifted again, glancing at one another, their expressions heavy with guilt and realization. For once, none of them laughed. None of them cheered. They simply absorbed the truth, unable to escape it. Chuck straightened slowly, his hand returning to rest on Dakota's shoulder. He looked once more across the hall, his gaze lingering on the faces of those who had stood by. "Remember this moment," he said. "Remember what you felt when you stood here, when you watched him put his hands on her and you did nothing. Remember the shame, and then remember what it felt like when someone finally stepped in. That is the difference between cruelty and courage, between weakness and strength." The students listened in silence, their eyes fixed on him, their shame undeniable. The lesson was carved into them now, etched by the weight of his voice and the sight of Jason crumpled on the floor. Finally, Chuck turned his gaze down to his daughter. She clung to him still, her breathing steadier now, her tears drying against her cheeks. He offered her a small nod, his eyes softening as he spoke quietly. "Just for her. You never have to thank me for protecting you, but one day you won't need me to. One day you'll be strong enough to protect yourself, and maybe even others." Her throat tightened at his words, but her heart swelled with something new. It wasn't just relief or even pride in him. It was the dawning recognition that his strength was not something distant, not something she could never touch. It was part of her too, waiting to be discovered. Together they began to walk down the corridor. The students parted instinctively, creating a path, their bodies moving aside like water before a prow cutting through waves. No one raised a phone. No one whispered. The silence was no longer fearful. It was reverent, the kind of silence that follows truth when there is nothing left to say. Jason remained slumped against the lockers, his pride shattered, his power dissolved. His friends lingered far from him, unwilling to share his shame. For all his bravado, for all the fear he had inspired, he was nothing now but a boy stripped of his illusions. As Chuck and Dakota neared the end of the hallway, he paused once more. He turned back to face the crowd, his eyes scanning them, steady and sharp. His final words rang through the corridor, clear and unshakable. Power without control is nothing. Courage without compassion is empty. Discipline is what gives strength meaning. Remember that. The silence deepened, etched into the hearts of every student, every teacher, every soul that had borne witness. Then without another word, he turned back and guided his daughter through the doors and into the daylight. The air outside was fresh, cool, carrying none of the suffocating weight of the hallway. Dakota drew in a deep breath, the sunlight warm on her face, her father's hand firm in hers. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt safe in her own skin. She felt seen. Inside, the hall remained heavy with the echoes of what had just unfolded. Students stood frozen, their voices hushed, their eyes darting with shame and reflection. Slowly they began to disperse, their movements subdued, their laughter gone. But the memory would not leave them. It would follow them, haunt them, remind them of the day when cruelty was stripped bare, when silence was exposed, when they learned what true strength looked like. And for Dakota, walking beside her father into the sunlight, the lesson was different but no less powerful. She had been reminded that she was not invisible, not powerless, not weak. She had endured the storm, and in its wake, she had discovered that the strength she admired in her father was alive within her too. It was there in the way she had survived, in the way she had endured, in the way she could now hold her head a little higher. The storm was over, but its echoes would remain forever in the halls of Ridgewood High. And for those who had witnessed it, for those who had laughed, recorded, or stood silent, the memory would return again and again, whispering the lesson that had been carved into them that day. That real strength is never in cruelty, never in fear, never in silence. Real strength is in the choice to protect, the choice to stand, the choice to be more. As Dakota and her father walked away from the building, her hands still clasped tightly in his, she knew that this day, for all its pain and humiliation, had given her something precious. Not just safety, not just justice, but the first glimpse of the strength that was hers to claim. And though her father had stood for her now, one day she would stand for herself. One day she would stand for others. One day she would be the one whose footsteps echoed down a silent corridor, steady, unyielding, unforgettable. If this story gave you chills, don't stop here. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss the next jaw-dropping story. Check out our other videos for more unbelievable moments that will leave you stunned. And don't keep this one to yourself, share it with your friends so they can feel it too. Your support keeps these stories alive.